Chapter 2: A Reincarnational Drama and Other Unofficial Events. The energy from that one class seemed to spread outward into my students' private lives. During the week, Sue Watkins called to tell me that she'd had an experience that she was positive was connected with Seth II's experiment. I was getting ready for bed, she said. The lights were all on. Suddenly, my arms and legs felt huge and much heavier. I looked down, and I swear they were that way. At the same time, this curious wonder flashed through my mind like, how fantastic bodies are! What amazing machines! And I was full of this appreciation of how bodies work. But it wasn't me. It was the most alien sensation. It was someone not used to living in a body at all. Dorothy, another student, called to tell me that she'd seen three-dimensional triangles around the ceiling of her dining room in the morning, 3 times in a row. And if my intellect wanted something to work on, my intuitive self was seeing to it that it got what it wanted, because the next class, once again, presented me with perfect examples of the kind of experiences that so intrigued me, yet threw me into a critical quandary. 5 students reported having class dreams in which they attended a class at another level of reality, with Seth as teacher. Such dreams, with many variations, are now a regular part of the class's extracurricular activities. In them, I'm convinced that students develop themes and experiences begun in class. Often, Seth is used as a symbol for the individual's own greater consciousness. In a class only last week, for example, a young man, Larry, told of a dream in which he saw Seth's face close to his own. Seth looked physical and real and appeared looking exactly like a portrait that my husband, Rob, painted of him several years ago. The painting hangs in the living room where class is held, and it has also been reproduced in the Seth material. In their dreams, many students see Seth in that guise. When Larry finished telling his dream, Seth came through with one of the best sessions to date. It began with the question, "Who is Seth?" The first part was directed to Larry, the dreamer. I'm quoting a few paragraphs from the session here, because they contain information that I didn't have back when class first started reporting class dreams. What Seth said the other night to Larry was this: "Who is Seth? I put this question to you. And what magic is worked here in class that you work and that we all work together? Now I will tell you this. On the one hand, I am someone you do not know, lost before the annals of time as you understand it, lost in the annals of the past and the future as you understand them. On the one hand, that is what I am, and that is a loaded sentence. On the other hand, I am yourself. So through me do you view and meet the selves that you are, and so I rise, in your terms, from the power and antiquity and the glory of your own being, projected outward into the world of time from a universe in which time is meaningless." In 1971, though, I was upset by the implications I saw in Seth as a spirit guide popping in and out of people's dreams, particularly since they took this as proof of Seth's independent existence in a way that bothered me. That particular night, then, I was fascinated by the dream events reported, but refused to accept pat explanations. And yet, I couldn't find any others that satisfied me. But the dreams were merely the beginning. As I listened, I suddenly felt Seth II's pyramid above my head again. Not physical, but just as real. I could feel my consciousness rushing upward, seeping out gradually at first, then faster. Even as I thought with mixed wonder and skepticism, bodiless observers from another world, triangles appearing from nowhere on dining room ceilings, and here I go again, I was gone. After a certain point, whenever Seth II is involved, there is an emptiness through which I sense I must travel, then a live spot of contact, then that atonal voice begins to speak. As always, students told me afterward what was said, and the session was recorded. "The experiment continues," the voice began. "We are trying to appreciate the nature of your present existence. So those of you who are curious about the nature of non-physical reality may then follow us, using this voice as a guideline into existence that knows neither blood nor tissue. Follow, then, beyond the knowledge of the flesh to those domains from which flesh is born. Feel the kernel of your consciousness rise beyond the knowledge of the seasons. For you there may seem to be an unbearable loneliness, because you are so used to relating to the warm victory of flesh, and here there is no physical being with whom to relate. Yet beyond and within that isolation is a point of light that is consciousness. It pulses with the power behind all of the emotions you know. It feeds them and sends them sparkling and tumbling down into the reality you recognize. This is the warmth that forms the pulse of physical existence, and yet is born from the very devotion of your isolation. That is born from creativity, that is beyond flesh and bone, that forms fingers without feeling fingers, that forms the seasons without knowing summer or winter, that creates the reality you know without itself experiencing it. From that devotion and creativity comes all that you know, and all of that has also been given to us. For the energy that we have is not ours alone, nor are we the source of it. It flows through us as it flows through you. The experiment, then, continues as it always has. Only in your past you were not aware of it. The voice stopped. I started my downward climb, getting lost and disoriented for a moment, then suddenly, surely, descending through many levels of awareness. Almost every student had experienced some expansion of consciousness while Seth II spoke. Raj, an engineer, felt as if he were alone in space with nothing to act against, and overwhelmed by loneliness. To one extent or another, many of the students felt the same kind of suspension and isolation. Joel, the young man who found himself involved in the Crusaders' battle the class before, also felt himself surrounded by space. He seemed to be bodiless, drawn toward a gigantic flower. As he fell headlong into the open petals, the inside of the flower expanded so that it seemed bottomless. He felt as if he could fall through it forever. His experience made me think. When Seth too came through, was I switching to another level of consciousness and observing physical reality from that viewpoint? Were Seth two's beings an unconscious dramatization of that level of awareness itself? Or did these beings exist in some other way, like Joel's flower? Was the flower Joel's own interpretation of another kind of consciousness too? In other words, how literally could we take Seth two's message? If Seth two was a representation of another portion of our own psyche, dramatized, then couldn't the message be interpreted to mean that other, non-physical parts of our present selves watched our reality, couched in our own psyches? And were we being encouraged to experience, to some degree, the vast portions of our own souls from which our physical reality springs? The difference between Seth and Seth two was dramatized that night too, because when the students finished discussing what happened, Seth came through. With Seth two, students had to strain to hear the quiet, unemotional, almost colorless tones. My face was expressionless, and my body slack. But Seth's voice boomed out. My body took on a more muscular, active air, and Seth was there, speaking and looking about. He often looks at particular people and singles them out, so there's no doubt about whom he's talking to. He spoke to Joel at once. Your flower was an excellent image, and in your terms it represents the characteristics of space as you might relate to it. Specifically, it is your symbol for the physicist's black hole. These black holes are other dimensions of actuality in which the reality that you know is automatically translated into different terms, not annihilated. Then he told the class that they were learning to manipulate at other levels of awareness. I knew that they were, of course, but I wasn't prepared for what followed. We were discussing class events and Seth's interpretation of Joel's mental adventure when I became aware of loud voices in one corner of the room. I heard the word Indian. Then people turned toward Joel and Betty. Their manner told me at once that they were involved in what I call a reincarnational drama. That is, they were convinced that they were acting out a definite episode from a past life. Again, these dramas intrigue me, but I'm always aware of how little we know about the nature of consciousness or memory. Now I see reincarnation in a much broader context than I did then, as you will see later in this book. Certainly, the following episode, among others, had much to do with the intense questioning that led me to aspects. Betty wore one of the long ankle-length skirts then coming into style. Her legs were spread out beneath it, her arms on her hips. It was easy to imagine a rifle lying across her knees. Her smallish eyes were furious. She looked for all the world like the 19th century pioneer woman she thought she was at that moment. "You only killed my whole damn family, kids and all," she hissed at Joel, and her eyes never left his face. "You killed your own husband," he said. To all of us, the normally slight Indian characteristics of his face seemed now exaggerated. His voice was tense, but didn't have the emotional force of Betty's. Then he said slowly, "You killed him. We didn't. What did you do it for?" "Because he was a coward. Because I had a bunch of crying kids, and I didn't need a crying husband to boot. Yes, I did it, and I'd do it again. Is that what you want to know?" Her voice was fiercely calm. The class was quiet. We were alert, ready in case Joel and Betty really got into it. I was having my own difficulties. In my mind, I saw the scene they'd been describing. Betty squatting in this hut of a house, on her hands and knees, almost handing out guns to the kids, while the Indian band came rushing over a hill toward the clearing. For an instant, through Betty's perspective, I heard the blood-curdling screams, howls really, and felt her fury. Her cries rose in my throat. I pulled myself together. I had the class to think of, and I wanted to monitor Betty and Tom's experience, not fall into it with them. But Joel was backing off some, I could tell. He said, You were taking our land. We were just defending it. Didn't you care what you were doing to us?" "Hell no," she cried, staring back at him. "Why should I? I didn't give a damn what happened to the Indians. I just cared about my kids. And I protected them, I'll tell you that. I knew when you were on the warpath, though. That I knew." Now her eyes were really beady. She leaned forward threateningly. Her emotional belligerence filled the room. There was a moment's silence. Then, as we watched, the intentness began to leave Joel's broad features. A smoothness seemed to fill in the contours of his face, and he started to speak as a personality called Dave. I'd heard Dave speak once before, but class hadn't, though they knew about him. I stayed where I was, watching Betty and Joel and the class reactions. All attention was riveted on Joel's face as students searched for differences between this speaking for Dave Joel and the Joel they knew. My reactions were mixed. I sensed the class's strong pivoting toward the new personality, the awe, the hope that perhaps here was the answer. Maybe Dave had the answer to life's problems and could explain them simply. They wouldn't have to work for their own answers. Someone else would do it for them. Great, they've learned a lot, I thought sardonically. There they sat, teachers, business people, college kids, listening to another voice, another guru, someone else who might have the answers and be flattered or cajoled enough to give them up. But I was being unfair, I told myself, and to some extent I was. The phenomenon of speaking for another personality is unusual and startling enough to capture anyone's attention, and brings to mind all of our old legends of gods speaking through mortals, spirits looking out of human eyes, gods, devils, and sprites cavorting through the fields of the human psyche. Dave's voice was much like Joel's. He spoke intently but dispassionately, while Betty stared back with a mixture of awe and defiance. She was still furious, but at Joe, not at Dave. "You knew that Indian men and women were dying," Dave said. "Didn't that affect you at all?" "All we knew was who was on the warpath and when," Betty said in a hard voice. "Did you know when your own race was on the warpath?" Dave asked calmly, as if translating or as if speaking to a child. "No!" Betty yelled angrily. "I was in my own existence. All I cared about were my kids, and you took care of that." She stopped, glowering, because Joel had been replaced by Dave, and from then on, when she answered Dave, she called him Sir, in a tone that neatly mixed deference with sarcasm. After a rather lengthy discussion, though, Betty said that she felt better toward Joel now, that she realized his people had been caught up in their own passion and were only trying to defend their land. She grinned and said, "Don't fight with me any more either. Just be nice." Her attitude was so different than it had been that a few people laughed. "I mean it," she said. "I learned a lot from that lifetime, and in this life I'm a regular crusader when it comes to Indians. I have great feeling for them. Whenever anyone mentions the blacks as the downtrodden minority, I remind them of the Indians, so I must have forgiven them for what they did to me." When Dave answered, though, Betty couldn't refrain from saying, "Oh, thank you, sir," and that hard look came back into her eyes. The entire episode took nearly an hour. Part of the time, Dave spoke alone or answered Betty's questions. Now and then, I asked a question, but all the while I kept myself focused on the objective room, because whenever I let my consciousness stray, I was back in that hut with Betty. I kept feeling her screams in my throat and was determined not to give voice to them. For one thing, I didn't want to interject my own perceptions at that point. This was primarily Betty's and Joel's experience, and I was curious as to what they'd do with it on their own. For another thing, I had the whole class to think of, and I wasn't about to unleash all that emotion in the room, particularly when I sensed that I'd be thrown into the event myself and unable to monitor it properly. There were no dates given for the Indian attack. Dave mentioned a name, Kiwate or Kiwata, but without giving its designation. When asked for the name of the tribe, he said, "It was an offshoot of a larger nation or conglomerate of tribes, and the language is not familiar to me, but it was something like Shonak." When it was all over, Betty said that she'd felt animosity toward Joel since he came to class, and that now she understood the reason for it, and also for her habitual passionate defense of the Indians. The emotions that had swirled around us just dissipated. As this happened, Joel shook his head, coughed, looked dazed for a moment, and said, "Hey, what's been going on?" What indeed? One thing was instantly apparent to me. Dave had come to Joel's aid precisely when Betty's belligerence was strongest. Moreover, he nicely took the wind from Betty's emotional sails, a fact I'm sure she recognized and resented. Dave was not Joel in the framework they were working in, and Dave's loftier attitude changed the immediacy of the earlier encounter to one in which Betty lost her equal status. On Joel's part, this was excellent psychological footwork at the least. 3 levels of activity were involved. The usual Joel as Indian in past life encounter, and Joel as David, a personality who was supposed to contain the knowledge of the other two. Yet the phenomenon itself bothered me. There was a strained quality about it, as if one part of Joel's personality didn't know what to do with the other part. The performance was cracked in a funny fashion, as if somebody was trying too hard, but with the best of intentions. Some sensed contact wasn't quite made. I didn't accept Dave as a spirit in usual terms, but then I didn't look at Seth that way either. The whole affair, of course, made me wonder again about the nature of Seth. But he is a fully rounded personality in a way difficult to explain, and he arrived in my experience that way. There was never any strain involved. While I appreciated the levels of consciousness being utilized by Joel, I was also struck by a certain feeling of grotesqueness, of ability that struggled to be used and yet was also caught in a dilemma of psychological duplicity. But all of this was quite aside from questions about the reincarnational material itself. Did Betty and Joel actually live the event they seemed to be remembering so vividly? Was I mentally hearing the piercing screams of a woman about to see her children slain? I'd felt as if I could have lost myself, for a while anyway, in that other time and place. Yet Betty, I knew, was filled with belligerence at this particular time in her life. Had the entire episode been a creative emotional drama that freed her from that pressure in a safe framework? Joel, then, would have had his own reasons for participating. Certainly, the entire class seemed released, purged. Had the two main actors dramatized the combined, withheld, aggressive energy of the entire group? My questions were endless, it seemed. Most of the students took it for granted that a definite reincarnational event had been re-experienced. I admit that the entire episode was valid, but I also suspected that its validity might straddle our concepts. Again, I felt that reincarnation was something far more significant than usually supposed, and that by accepting it per se, we might prevent ourselves from discovering its real meaning. A short time later, as you'll see, I was to be presented with a unique example of a past life personality and a surprising encounter involving Sue and my husband, Rob, an experience which would also throw light on Joel's performance in class as Dave. As it was, I knew enough not to interpret our experiences in old dogmatic ways. The dogma of spiritualism or reincarnation can be quite as limiting as any more conventional church dogma. Yet I was unable to see another framework, so I kept knocking my head against mental walls. From Seth II to Indian war cries was quite enough for one evening. From bodiless observers from another system of reality to the emotional power of Betty's belligerence against a man she believed had wiped out her entire family over a century ago. But whatever was going on, we all had to get up early in the morning, so I ended class. Yet, as people filed out of the room, I thought, how great that we all feel free enough to explore the nature of our own consciousness together. Who knows what we might discover? And I still feel that way. The next day, though, I spent 2 hours writing down my impressions of that class and trying to sort out my own attitudes. I just put a piece of paper in the typewriter and started writing whatever came to mind without questioning. I find this an excellent method of releasing pertinent ideas. In fact, until I read what I'd written, I didn't realize that I'd actually chosen one main direction from several others that had also attracted me. I'd found the spirit guide designation more and more hampering. At the same time, that's exactly how people related to Seth. Whenever I objected, they became confused. For one thing, many people want desperately to believe in life after death, and spirit guides automatically offer them proof. Besides this, however, the concept presents a framework in which a spirit can be encountered in any medium's living room without other intermediaries to bring comfort, solve problems, and provide an intimacy with spiritual realities that the churches have long forsaken. Even in the beginning of my own experiences, I didn't think it was that simple, nor, for that matter, did Seth describe himself in those terms, but up to this June class, I'd suspected my own doubts. Maybe my intellect was getting in the way, I thought. Maybe Seth was a spirit guide, just as people said, and in exactly those terms. And maybe reincarnation existed the way others thought it did too. After reading over my own notes the next day, though, I saw that I wasn't going to let Seth be stereotyped, and that I had to allow my own experience to expand in its own way. My attitude towards Seth was pretty well expressed in the following paragraph. Last night, Seth too led us into adventures in consciousness that are liberating, creative, and valid. I think that they certainly increase individual perception and may be forming a group class level of awareness that overlaps into the dream state. But I don't want to feel forced to visualize a disembodied spirit peeking in on us. I think we're really on to something, but I don't know what it is yet. If we take it for granted that everything we can't explain is the result of spirits, then we're just left with dogma again. About the reincarnational drama, I wrote. Again, a terrific adventure in consciousness for those involved, in which the participants experienced reality in a different way and set up new gestalts of relatedness. They looked at existence from an entirely different focus than usual, and to some extent or another, this let each class member do the same thing. As such, I think that this was constructive, dynamic, and exciting. I don't know whether or not Joel and Betty were reliving definite past events, or whether the idea of reincarnation provided a framework through which these experiences could flow, releasing them from usual life roles. Maybe it doesn't even matter, but I think that there is strong pressure from people involved in the psychic field, amateurs and professionals alike, to accept such events at their face value. Sometimes, from their remarks and letters, I think that people want to believe in something so badly that they feel threatened when I question my own experience, or that they want me to write a kind of Bible from which all uncertainty is removed for them. But then I'd be caught up in a dogma that I'd be sworn to protect, and I'd never have the guts to examine my own ideas again. I just can't go looking for neat little cliché symbols to tuck my experience in. Because underneath it all, there's something invaluable that, as a people, we've always overlooked. And just maybe I can get a few clues as to what it is. I wrote those paragraphs vehemently, certainly exaggerating to some degree, but at least I felt clearer about my own attitudes than I had in some time. Considering my feelings, you can imagine my reaction to Martin Crocker, who attended my class. The appointment had been set up some months earlier. Martin, I found, personified all the ideas that I'd just decided I could do without. End of chapter 2.